So was Paul's gospel anti-imperial? The answer to this one is always going to be nuanced and difficult to answer in some ways. It doesn't allow for a straightforward yes or no. In some ways, Paul's gospel is supra-imperial. That is, it's a gospel that sails higher than any form of the imperial gospel, and in that sense critiques the imperial gospel from above, but perhaps implicitly. So the question is, to what extent did Paul's gospel come alongside and critique the imperial gospel of his day? The Roman imperial gospel, which spoke of Rome as the eternal city, the city blessed by the gods, overseen by the deified emperor who was worshipped, an empire that unifies people, an empire that brings plenty and abundance to the world, and an empire in which the nations are united. So there are a lot of facets of the imperial gospel that Paul shares in many ways. So the question is, to what extent was Paul cognizant of this? To what extent was Paul expecting Christians who were reading his letters to hear anti-imperial dimensions to them, to those letters? And we have to say that at times Paul tilted his message in a way that the anti-imperialism emerges in a way that would certainly have been noticeable to those on the ground. The case in point here is probably 1 Thessalonians 5, where Paul uses the Roman imperial slogan, peace and security, and in a sense puts it in its place. There's another gospel that supersedes a gospel of peace and security. So there's a case in which he seems to articulate his theology directly in relation to the Roman imperial gospel. There are other times where he tilts things in the other direction, and this would be, say, Romans 13, where he talks about the ruling authorities as being divinely instituted. They are in place as God would like them to be, instilling that there's order within society. Paul did not want the ruling authorities to be yanked out of position and the whole of society to tumble into chaos. He saw them as instruments of God, ensuring that the God of creation, the God of order, that the rule of God was operating in a sense even through these secular authorities who ensure that society doesn't deteriorate into chaos and anarchy. So there he sounds a bit more pro-Roman, pro-imperial. And there are other times where he leaves his gospel unarticulated in one direction or another. Perhaps readers would have heard it as anti-imperial. We see episodes of this in Acts, where they're saying these people are peddling a gospel other than Caesar, proclaiming an empire that is not Caesar's empire. And so it's certainly being heard in those ways. So these are ingredients that we need to throw into the mix when we ask this kind of question. Sometimes Paul can tip it in a certain direction, but in another moment he can tip it back. And in other times he leaves these resources undeveloped, either implicit for readers to spot, as some would argue, or simply undeveloped theologically. So it's a gospel in which the very fact that it's supra-imperial, it's a gospel that supersedes the gospel of imperial Rome. In that way, it's anti-imperial, and at times it takes on the discourse of being anti-imperial, but in other times it's more measured and less obvious. So this is the world in which Paul lived, a world in which the Roman imperial order is the main power behind all that's happening in the world, to exaggerate only slightly. And Paul must have thought about his gospel in relation to that power. But the extent to which his discourse is informed by an anti-imperial discourse is is a messy one. It's a messy situation in which we can't say yes or no, but we would be wrong to say that it's not anti-imperial, or at least that it doesn't have ingredients of anti-imperialism in it. Paul was able to address the empire and its gospel in certain ways and to critique it in certain moments and in certain regards. So the resources are there for Christians today to do theologizing of that kind, and we can use Paul at times for those purposes in terms of critiquing society in relation to the gospel of Christ.